my God, one is thirsty in the desert and what to drink but Coke. The paradox of Coke is that you are thirsty, you drink it, but as everyone knows, the more you drink it, the more thirsty you get. So, let's have a drink of Coke.
Okay. If I got this correctly, the audio shouldn't be echoing. If it is, someone's going to have to tell me to deal with that. Very finicky. Anyways, as long as this is working, get the introduction. This is a bit of an impromptu stream. Something that me and a few people have been talking about doing for a long while is talking a bit about the history of the pulps, a little bit more about them, and then also an argument for the return. So here I've got the two people who've blown smoke up my ass about this for, I think, a solid month or two. Greg has actually been doing it for like a year. But I've got Greg with me, and I've got Franzel back. Franzel's going to be our resident expert on the history of the pulps here. He's actually pulled off a lovely book from his bookshelf. Can you tell us what that book is?
I pulled off 3 books from my bookshelf. I pulled off Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars trilogy. I pulled off the giant 35th anniversary issue of Amazing Stories from 1961. And I pulled off the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then Greg is actually just a big fan of the pulps and knows a lot more about them than I do.
Yeah, I basically been cyberbullying Andrew this whole time to do a video like this.
Uh-huh.
I got interested with them ever since I played that video game about Conan, the Conan Exiles, and it was just a natural curiosity on the story behind that and the author. And I started finding out about other pulps like John Carter, Mars, which Franzel has a book right now of.
Yes.
And there was also Solomon Kane, can't forget that guy. So I'm just here to like learn more about it with y'all and discuss it with you.
Okay, well, the history of the pulps is way out of my wheelhouse, so I think Franz is going to have to start us off about that. A little bit about like what defines the pulps. Before the stream, I was mentioning my general conception of it, where it's not a fixed style of writing. It's not something like, this is what a poem is, this is what a novel is. It's more of a family resemblance term, and more to do with a period of time of a certain kind of literature.
I think that's essentially correct. I think everyone kind of knows like the basic idea behind the pulps, that they we're dealing with short to mid-length stories which were published in what was called pulp magazines. They called this because of like the wooden kind of low quality paper these stories were printed in, and these magazines were mostly popular, I think, in the 1920s and 1930s,
Mm-hmm.
where they were mostly used to publish all different kinds of genre fiction. So
Yeah.
you would have mystery, science fiction, horror, romance, crime,
Yeah, the
and
only
war stories.
the only
Sorry.
pulp author that I'm really familiar with or spent any time with was Michael Moorcock, and he wrote everything. From like Elric and Melniboné started off as a pulp story. Shoot, I'm forgetting one of the other ones. What is it? The Zenith the Albino, where he originally got the idea from, but then he started writing stories with him, sort of as a part of the Elric universe, or the multiverse, more technically. I think Corum got its start there. The multiverse, that whole thing kind of ebbs and flows between fantasy and science fiction, so it's not really stagnant. But it was all part of the pulps, and I know you would have different. I think Elric started off in Amazing Tales, I think, which did everything. So it was really just a publishing vehicle for a lot of short stories, fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, the whole shebang.
This is quite interesting because, like, especially when you look back at pulps and science fiction pulps, you will very quickly see that the way these magazines started was actually by printing European stories in the science fiction genre, something like the stories by H.G. Wells or Jules Verne. Hopefully I didn't X the French name. Sorry.
I'm not gonna get that mad about it. Don't worry.
It's okay, I do overtime for so mostly despite Andrew.
So, spiting the Frenchman. So basically, most of the time, these older stories were then published in a serialized form. But over time, stories by up-and-coming writers were published as well, because there was like a good way to kind of sneak in newer stories. Like you were going to give people the stories they kind of wanted to read, something like, I don't know, War of the Worlds, and then you would give them less famous kind of stories, give them new kind of original content, and over time that content itself became popular with the readers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think of. Dog's going up. Okay. I don't know of any modern corollaries off the top of my head. There's certainly gonna be something like that, like some music radio station that will play the hits, but then also try to put out up and coming artists, and that it's the same kind of thing that the pulps were being utilized as. I'm trying to remember all the people who got their starts writing pulp stories, and like The Shadow is a good example of this, where it starts off there, and then it's something that goes off and becomes its own thing, still going on to this day. Like, we're still printing Shadow stories and Shadow books.
So I'm guessing the pulps was like a sort of early 20th century Spotify, where you have just nobody's coming up who want to make a name for themselves, and they use this very simple avenue to achieve that goal. Is that correct?
Yes. Essentially, it is correct. That was kind of like the benefit of like storytelling magazines that used like the anthology format. Where, again, we would have multiple stories in one magazine.
Yeah, because I kind of noticed that early comics were also like that as well. Like some of Stan Lee's earliest Captain America in World War II. You don't really see Marvel comics. You see like something like Amazing Stories or Mystery Tales, something like in the case of Batman. Like I also heard there's like a connection between both the comics and the pulps. Could you elaborate a little more on that as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's some like of the more overt kind of inspirations that early comic books, including superhero comic books, took from the pulps. Like when you see the first Batman story in Detective Comics 27, it is essentially a rip-off of a Shadow story. On the other hand, if you look at something like Superman in Action Comics #1, that too, you see kind of like the basic abilities that Superman has at that point. He doesn't fly, he just takes huge leaps, and it's hard not to think about John Carter of Mars, especially when you then figure out, oh, the guys who wrote Superman were actually quite into science fiction themselves, so they likely read the John Carter stories.
I've always kind of liked that about the early pulp characters because they didn't really try to do this thing you see in a lot of modern science fiction or fantasy where you have this sort of, I don't know exactly what the term they use, but like power climbing, like with Dragon Ball Z, where there's constantly this need to make the characters more powerful with each addition to the story or something like that, and it just makes any conflict meaningless. With the pulps, they are extraordinary, but they're just human enough to make it a challenge. Like, for example, John Carter. Unlike Goku, he still has to be mindful of what he's capable of. He can't just like yell like he's about to have an aneurysm and then become super strong. They all need opponents who can match them, and then they have to rely on something like their wit. Or if they meet someone who's stronger or someone who is smarter than them, and maybe rely more on their physicalities.
Yeah, I remember, I'm not too familiar with the Conan stories, but from what you told me is that Conan goes from this absolute, like, every stereotype you can imagine for a barbarian. He does, like, he's illiterate, he hates magic and like this weird voodoo stuff, he wants to kill sorcerers. And then later on, he starts to develop as the challenges go more and more. He goes, okay, magic isn't too bad. Maybe I can use it. He starts to appreciate other things and actually grow as a character in very subtle ways.
One of my most favorite changes Conan has is his approach to religion as he gets older. It's sort of a more brutal, upfront version of the old man finding religion at the end of his life.
Oh yeah, didn't you tell me about this? Where at one point he goes, "No, Crom is cool. Yeah, Crom's cool, but I can't let anyone know because they'll call me dumb."
Yeah, because he's fighting the sorcerer who isn't just again, Francis, you can correct me on this, but the sorcerer who was both skilled as a warrior and a sorcerer, so he could match Conan pound for pound, and he was about to get killed by this guy, and all of a sudden this hooded figure kills the sorcerer in front of Conan. And then he looks behind, it's Crom, and Crom tells him, yeah, the only reason why I'm sparing you now is because your death later is going to be freaking hilarious. And after that, Conan just constructs this small altar to Crom. He's very paranoid that his friends will find out, like Andrew said, and mock him for finally finding God after mocking religion for all these years. And that's it's those kind of little things I enjoy about these characters.
Yeah, it's this actually very subtle and very real growth and maturity where, yeah, we can go where, oh, he becomes an absolute zealot and, total conversion and starts waving the banner, even though we know for a fact anyone who converts from this kind of, anti-theism, more he wasn't simply oh, I just don't believe in this stuff, I don't care. No, he was actually kind of active against it, going in the movie goes, if you don't answer my prayers, then to hell with you. That kind of disposition, and then going, oh, switching teams, so to speak, and then being kind of embarrassed about it. It's actually a shot to his pride, and he has that actual interesting note of character where he does hide it for a while because he's afraid of being mocked for this drastic change.
There's another thing in Conan that I find fascinating, and that is how at least the pulp version is so very different from how you would kind of paint heroes and what sets them on their quest nowadays. And that's actually something that's different from the movie, where in the movie is essentially on quest for revenge because his parents got murdered in front of him. He was strapped to a giant wheel for how many years?
The wheel of pain was the first bull flex. That's how he got that.
I look at that scene and it's gonna hit the legs and maybe some shoulders from an isometric hold. But how do you get the biceps? How do you get the core?
He would just leap over the Bowflex. He would leap, the wheel of pain's handle, and then he just pull the wheel.
So, but yeah, what I'm getting at is if you kind of compare this to the original Conan stories, he goes out because he essentially seeks adventure. He seeks something new. So it's a much simpler kind of motivation in the pulps themselves. And that's something I honestly quite appreciate about them, that their heroes are very straightforward. They see something they find interesting. They have like a very strong moral compass, where if they think something is unjust, they will just jump in and help.
Mm-hmm. Which kind of makes sense because the pulps are very self-contained stories. You don't have the ability to, at least not initially, right at the get-go. Maybe later on when it becomes its own thing. But right at the get-go, you just have very simple, isolated stories for the most part. You can't give out this long, drawn-out backstory of this character's motivation, so you end up with going, Conan, he's big and strong, he wants adventure, here's some fun time.
And that is interesting because even with, we quickly talked about superheroes and how they were inspired by the pulps, at least early on. You can see this as well in the first comic in which Batman makes an appearance. It's not like immediately his tragic backstory. It's just he's a guy, he dresses like a bat, and he fights crime.
Yeah, no, it's kind of how the Shadow starts out. It's just he shows up, guy in a cloak and a hat with a massive beak of a nose with 245 guns, and he's out there killing scumbags. That's all you need to know. Here's his story. Here's an adventure he goes on. And then later on, you do get these. Well, with the Shadow, it's more like hearsay stuff. His backstory's not laid down in cement. It's always kind of like rumors for the most part, with different takes on how he came to be. But that doesn't come till later when he starts off on his own thing. Same thing with Conan. He's basically just, I'm a big guy with a sword and I fight things. But then later on, he starts to develop more and more of a character as he becomes his own IP.
The more interesting pulp character I would have to say, though, who kind of stands out from the rest, would be Solomon Kane, because you do kind of see that like motivation for vengeance, even though he doesn't know this girl who died like on the road.
And then that unbelievably metal line, "Men will die for this." Simple, to the point. There's his motivation.
He goes on a road trip to find these guys
for years.
Like Germany, and then Africa, and then Asia, and back into Africa, I think. And he's like, "Yeah, remember, you don't know me, but you killed a girl. I'm here to rectify that."
I love that so much. It's just, you get your character motivation, and it's really simple, but it's at the same time, he doesn't know this girl. He knows nothing about it. But then he goes on this multi-year quest to find these guys, and just delivers that beautiful line, "Men will die for this." Like, there you go. That's how you get an Avenger, this stoic.
I mean, doesn't this make these characters so much more interesting, that this is how they tick?
Yeah, you don't need this long drawn out backstory about, oh, this dead girl reminded him of a long lost love. You don't know that. You can speculate about it, but it's just, here's the motivation. You can speculate what you want, but here's the adventure. Here's the fun. Here's the story.
Like, I hate how modern stories, especially with like superhero and sci-fis, are just a reference to some other story. It can't be self-contained. It can't just be its own thing, and that just gets annoying.
Yeah, like every Spider-Man reboot. Yeah, every Spider-Man reboot, we have to kill Uncle Ben again. It can't just be, here's the guy, he swings from webs, have fun.
I'm not even referring to that. I'm like referring to, like, say, the Marvel movies. Every Marvel movie for each individual here, you always gotta have a freaking reference to another hero. Or something like that. And that gets annoying. You can't, can I just watch a movie about Iron Man? I don't really need to know about Nick Fury.
Yeah.
Or can I watch a movie about Spider-Man? Why do I need to know about Tony Stark? What does Tony Stark have to do with Spider-Man?
The only thing that kind of gets close to that level would be Michael Moorcock's Multiverse. But at least in the Elric saga and in, Ericose, take care of your mic there, Greg. You're getting a lot of background sound. Yeah.
There's wind in the background. The camera tool was moving its way in.
No, it just sounds like it's jiggling around. But yeah, with like Elric, Ericose, and Corum, you get these points where the other characters do pop up. I think, what is it? In Sailors on the... You're having a real rough time, Greg. But in Sailors on the Seas of Fate, it's like the first story in it where they get on the damn boat. all these other characters come up and Elric doesn't recognize them, but these are actual other IPs from other Moorcock stories, because they actually do all share a grand universe and they jump between dimensions into each other's stories every once in a while. But it's literally just Sailors on the Seas of Fate, and then they drop out for a good long while, and then they don't show back up until the Vanishing Tower long later. And then, again, it's just a cameo. They're not. They've never done any like Avengers stuff where they're like constantly doing these referential back and forth between them all. So it's not obscene.
In all fairness, that's how it started in comic books as well. When you got something like the first meeting between Batman and Superman, it wasn't so much. We have planned towards this for decades now. It's more, hey, you know what would be a fun thing to do that will sell issues really well? And it's just that over time you do more and more of this stuff, and readers kind of expected it, and so you eventually got convoluted lore.
Yeah. But even then, I can kind of forgive that, because that works because you know Superman and Batman on their own are enjoyable characters. Why the combination works. Nowadays, it's you can't have the characters work on their own without the reference. It's kind of inversed. Which is why I think these books are very interesting. You could read these without them interacting with other characters from the same author, and you could still enjoy them.
Yeah, it doesn't suppose any backstory or things you need to know. Even with the Elric stuff, Elric is being your eyes there. So if you're coming in, that's the first book you're reading is Sailor on the Seas of Fate, and Elric is meeting all these other characters that were written before him, and they're there as cameos. Elric goes, I don't know you people, who the hell are you? So he's right there with you, and you're just as weirded out as he is. But then if you know the other stories, you go, oh, I know these people. Oh, I understand the stuff they're referencing when they talk, and blah, 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 blah. But it's not contingent. It is just the Sailors on the Seas of Fate is an acid trip where it's confusing and crazy. So if you don't know what's going on, well, cool. That's kind of the point. Elric is right there with you.
It's the pulp version of the boat arc.
Yeah, kind of. It's actually very, very crazy. They do so much weird stuff. They kill the entire universe at one point and then revive it in the next. That's something that happens there, and it's just kind of brushed over.
It's also what we talked about when the heroes are like that straightforward and easy to understand. It doesn't really matter where you jump in, right?
Yeah, Sailors on the Seas of Fate starts off with Elric is adventuring on the Young Kingdoms. People don't like him. He's running away. The story begins with him at the shoreline going, I'm screwed. And then the boat shows up, and then that's where the adventure begins. You don't need to know about the previous story of, what is it, the Dreaming City, for you to get into that.
Right, one of the first John Carter stories I read was John Carter and the Giant of Mars, and you immediately get, okay, he's hanging around with a princess, great monster attack, suddenly the princess is gone, now he has to get the princess. It's very easy to understand, it's not, what do I need to know now? Whereas, even with comic books, you nowadays have this problem where you kind of jump into something and you feel like you've just missed 100 years worth of story.
Uh-huh.
You just
These stories need details within the details, which just takes too much time.
Yeah, it sometimes. I remember when I came fresh into comic books as a kid. That was actually quite a scary experience, because sometimes you had these stories where you felt as though you need an encyclopedia next to you,
which defeats the whole purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there you have this story which is supposed to be quick paced and easy to understand, but I'm just sitting there how does this relate to what?
Mm-hmm.
And to get back to the subject of it being a very wide, diverse amount of settings for these for the pulp genre, there's a big contrast between the sort of more fantasy medieval, the modern era, and then the future with all the sci-fi stuff. One area I'm a little uninformed is on the noir genre. And I don't know if it's technically pulps, but you definitely see a lot of themes from it, especially when you look at guys like the Shadow, who's like a noir character to the bone. I mean, you kind of told me a little bit about how the city in of itself, Andrew, can also be a character. Could you like?
Mhm.
explain a little bit
Oh,
about that?
oh, yeah, right, like that. Well, like in noir films, the idea of the city is it's always a bit confusing, and it's representative of its life as journey. You always find these characters kind of lost, no direct. Like you don't start off with a noir film with a guy going, "I know everything's all put together. I know what I'm doing, where I'm going in the world." No, it's always the stereotypical noir character is the down on his luck detective, sipping brandy out of a cup, smoking a cigar and just going, life sucks. I don't know where I'm going. What am I doing? With like the light coming in from the twisted shades and all that kind of stuff. It's this confusion, loss, and searching. That's the entire film for the most part, as the search for companionship, communication with other people, and a place in the world. So it's always this exploration. So the city is kind of representative of that, as being twisting and turning and constantly moving in this state of confusion.
And you have like guys like Conan, who's this sort of mythological character from a primordial age, long forgotten in man's early days. And then you could go to the future with like someone like, I don't know if he started off as a pulp character, but definitely Buck Rogers got some pulp vibes.
Buck Rogers definitely started out as a pulp character. In fact, originally he was called Anthony Rogers, and was his first story was in Amazing Stories, Armageddon 2419.
But that's kind of what I like about it. It's very hard to get bored with this kind of type of literature. Which is something I think would really impress a lot of people nowadays. Where you have very tight and well-defined genres nowadays. They're strictly fantasy, they're strictly sci-fi, they're strictly historical fiction.
Yeah, it's
that's pretty much an artificial distinction that came later.
right. But what you're kind of touching on is part of where, like, the point of talking about this at all, and is that it's kind of a half step away from a lot of media garbage that we get now. Where, yeah, sure, it is kind of, it's like, it's literature trash, and that's what it was started off being seen as, and I think for a very long time. It is just something you go in and you read these cutesy little stories. These aren't Shakespeare. No one ever thinks of them that way, but they are consumable. It is a very, like, it's the Pringles can of literature, and that's, we all understand it to be that way. But then at one and the same time, maybe it's just because of where we're sitting right now, from the kind of stuff that goes for that nowadays, like these really cheaply produced YouTube videos and like TV shows and all that kind of stuff. It is a half step away, where you're not just sitting there being a passive viewer, having the images beamed right into your skull looking at a TV screen. To read the pulps, you do actually have to go away, sit down someplace quiet, and actually read the damn thing. So it is a half step away from consumerism, I would say, par excellence, and into a different mode, a slower mode, rather than the constant barrage of images and the spectacle that we're usually feeding in now. So that's why I only refer to it as a half step away. It's still a long shot from reading Paradise Lost or something like that, but these things do kind of provide a mediary point to step away from this constant barrage of what is frankly trash.
These stories are like a whole lot less intimidating for like the average reader too. I mean, you don't have to like immediately go in and read something like Shakespeare or, I mean, even Tolkien. Like, similarly, you could look at something like Conan or Solomon Kane or Carter, Buck Rogers, and you'd be reading a good story. It may not be, well, it may not be massive, may not be a lot of depth to it, but you're making your mind active, and just a good excuse to learn about a good, simple story of good and evil.
It's a breaking up the monotony, as it slows you down a little bit, but it is still this kind of, it's entertainment at the end of the day. You're not doing this, no one's expecting you to do this deep analysis of, like, Solomon Kane killing a dude, because he found a dead body somewhere. No one's asking for that. It is easily consumable entertainment, but the kind of mode that it comes to you in is a bit better than the constant stream of images that I find myself so against nowadays. All right, so do we want to go into that thing you've been blowing smoke up my ass about returning to the pulps and writing new ones and getting back in that mode of?
Hold on. Let me get the fireplace going. Then I'll be able to get enough smoke for that. But
Well, there is actually like at least like a bit of a sub movement of writers who are kind of talking about the pulp revolution as something that is worth aspiring towards, simply because these stories had like a very basic appeals for readers of all kind of variants. Like they are very simple good versus evil stories. They are in a sense some.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, almost by necessity, because it's so short and you have to have people be able to come in at any point and be able to follow. You couldn't do these very topical political statements. It can't be a vehicle for like anti-Vietnam. Well, I mean, it could be in some instances. Like The Shadow did a little bit of that with like returning war veterans at one point. But still, it's not like The Shadow is not simply this metaphor for workers' unions or something. It's not this political vehicle. It is still The Shadow, and he just shoots scumbags. That's the basis of it.
at the end of the day, it's just a labor of love.
Yeah.
It's not really a way of projecting your politics
Mm-hmm.
on somebody.
Now, it can do that, but it's still the simplicity of the character makes them, in one point, timeless, and then also lends themselves to actually tackle certain contemporary things. Like after World War II, they did have in the Shadow radio drama, they did touch on the idea of returning war vets and their PTSD and how they're kind of abandoned by society. That is touched upon. It's not heavy-handed. They just reference it, saying the villain here is actually a returning war vet, and he's been driven crazy because he's been abandoned to the streets. It's not the Shadow's not delivering this big soliloquy about, society, blah, 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 blah. No, he's still the Shadow, and he's going to hit you with the double 45s and say what evil lurks in the hearts of men. That's who he is. So it still allows a kind of flexibility, and allows it to lend itself to almost any period. Like the Shadow starts off in the 1930s. So he's dealing with gangsters like Al Capone, but you can just teleport the Shadow to almost any period. He could be running around in the 70s, the 90s, 2020. Easy. He's just a guy with guns and a cloak. Yeah. So, yeah, and then you have, like, Conan. He's in an entirely different universe, so you can always use him no matter what. Elric of Melniboné. The multiverse has time travel aplenty. He shows up in the modern period, like, on multiple occasions. So the multiverse itself, from Michael Moorcock's universe, lends itself completely to this infinite interpretation and infinite stories. So you always have this well to keep going back to and producing new stories in whatever period you're in. The Shadow lends himself to any period. Elric lends himself to any period. These are timeless characters that allow themselves to be molded to how they need to be presented in the moment they are.
And Buck Rogers has been reinterpreted multiple times during the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you kind of look at it, like the first Buck Rogers story is very much earthbound. Like the later comic strips for the newspapers were more science fiction oriented. That's kind of like the theme they later went with something like the 1970s/1980s show. So it's something that can return in various forms, because like the core works so well. And I think that's probably the most redeeming feature of the pulps, is like, again, it's the simplicity, and like I wouldn't even say that the pulps so much have like politics as they have like this very kind of straightforward good versus evil. This is what heroism looks like. This is what villainy looks like. Kind of well due to them, mostly dictated by the way these stories are told.
Yeah, it's always the story and the adventure takes precedence over any kind of like heavy-handed moralizing. It's like you can see it there. In the radio drama with the Shadow, there is a statement about, like, I think he says, no, he didn't let us down. We let him down. He went crazy and started killing people because we abandoned a war veteran. But it's very subtle. He just mentions it. It's not a long soliloquy. But still, it was the adventure that took precedence. It's still this isolated story that is supposed to be fun. It is supposed to be entertainment at the end of the day. So they really can't get into these flaccid moralizing that we might get. Like, people complain about it in comic books right now, where Spider-Man is talking about like income, income inequality or something, and it's so dated. It's going to be novel for 5 seconds, and then we're going to move on to something else. But there's nothing going to get old about what evil lurks in the hearts of men. The Shadow knows. That'll never get tired of simple good and evil battles, and it's always that simple narrative that will take precedence over that reflexivity of being able to tune it to the modern era whenever you need to. It is still a good versus evil story.
And the best part about being in the 21st century right now is we probably are in the best position to make the pulps come back a reality.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of decentralized means of like promoting content.
And I think a lot of this stuff is it's not copyrighted. I think anyone could write a Conan story and wouldn't get pounded down by that. As far as I know Michael Moorcock has kind of said, if you want to write a story about the multiverse with characters in it, have at it. I think he's been pretty open about that, as far as I'm aware. As long as you give him the credit for it. There was like some hubbubs of things in the past, but it is kind of open source as far as I'm aware.
I mean, yes, like there's also like a reason why something like H.P. Lovecraft's various ideas get reused and reused.
Yeah.
I know Mr. Burroughs' stuff is in the public domain, so you could definitely make the Barsoom series have a good comeback. I mean,
people have done this already. Like, there are writers who've written their own John Carter stories that even have been printed.
Yeah, it's kind of, in my mind, the way that it's structured makes it superior almost inherently, is that you would have to sit down and do this as a labor of love. This is not going to Hollywood with a script and trying to get funding for your screenplay or anything like that, where there is this kind of, let's call it this capital economic interaction that kind of makes you bend to the signs of the times, versus you just get to write whatever you want out of love for these characters and produce something that's actually decent, where the story is actually going to take precedence, because it's not this massive budget that's required for it. It's a simple short story. So you can actually produce them in large numbers, get them out quite easily, and have the best writers kind of rise to the surface and get those good stories actually written.
You know what that means, Frenzel? Time to flood fanfiction.net.
Yeah, I'm terrified about that. No, we're not. Don't go there and do
John
that.
Carter mass fanfiction. Honestly, that would be kind of amazing.
Yeah, it's one of the best ways in my mind to do this kind of a unplugging, this disconnection, instead of trying to get your entertainment and media consumption from large companies that produce the stuff that are kind of beholden to particular trends. Instead, actually go down to something a bit more simplistic, easier to produce, and allows it to kind of divorce itself from typical trends. So, like, all the stuff that people are complaining about comics nowadays, about how it's heavy-handed garbage and moralizing, blah, 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 blah. Instead, go to, like, the little penny books guys producing stories for fun that are just fun little adventures. And start patroning them and trying to get that going. And it's this return to the pulps, and this revivification for it. Because there's a large sphere that's allowed to do that might be open and ripe for the taking, far and away from a lot of the stuff people don't like about entertainment now.
Yes, and like one of the best things about it, like these pulps in the past is, and I think that could happen nowadays as well. Like, they've been breeding grounds for great authors. Like someone like Ray Bradbury made his he kind of published his first stories in the pulps. So I mean, it would be interesting to see people just kind of use this template, and maybe when it becomes popular, you could you could actually see like fresh, interesting writers arise from this.
I mean, a lot of people tend to forget that like some of the biggest science fiction blockbusters of all time, like Star Wars, was essentially just a simple love letter to that field of.
Yeah, it was based off of, what was it called?
Star Wars was
Zap-
originally George Lucas wanted to make a Flash Gordon movie.
Yeah, Flash Gordon. That's I was gonna say
Yeah,
Zap
but-
Brannigan, but that's Futurama.
He wanted to direct Dune, I think. He got very upset that he didn't get to be the director.
Oh,
so
he wanted to do Flash Gordon. That's what he wanted.
I thought it was Dune.
Nah, David Lynch did Dune,
Yeah.
and Alexander Jodorowsky wanted to do Dune. That's a different story entirely. Yeah, essentially, you wanted to do Flash Gordon, and if you look at Flash Gordon, that's pretty much that came in the same vein as something like Buck Rogers, and here we already have like a direct connection. So it is very much in that vein.
A lot can be done with it, which is why I'm very interested in this field of genre. It's just a lot of untapped potential, and I think people are really underappreciating that because I think they just get demoralized by the very sad state of modern entertainment.
Oh yeah. No, even the modern incarnations of a lot of these stories are really poor imitations. The recent Shadow comics, throw them away, don't look at them. Like they're that bad. You don't want to look at them. I think.
Is this School Shooter one?
Yeah, when that shows up and it's like, no, the Shadow wouldn't be sitting down and talking with the guy. He'd blow his brains out with a .44 caliber, and then say something cool. Like that's the Shadow. He's not sitting there giving therapy lessons to school shooters. And I think they even came up with a recent Solomon Kane story, or at least a recent one that was really lackluster. I mean, you can kind of tell because I'm blanking on it if it even exists. And I don't even know if you could. I don't even know if any publisher is brave enough to put out a Conan the Barbarian story. Like,
Oh, yikes! I mean,
maybe they'd bring back the Conan cartoon where the transfer from.
I think
I swear I
Marvel's
remember
doing-
this.
sorry.
Hold
I
on.
mean,
This
Conan video games have made Conan's made a very strong comeback in the video games. I
yeah, in
mean,
the video games
Conan-
at least. But I'm thinking about bringing back the Conan the Barbarian cartoon where this might be a fever dream, but I swear I remember the transfer from season 1 to season 2 of that was Conan used to have a bird companion, and then they just wanted to stop doing it. So in season 2, some guy goes, "Hey Conan, what happened to your bird?" And he just says, "I ate him." Bring that back. Bring that back, please. That was great. Bring
I
back
like-
Evil Lack.
I like how he golf putted a giant spider too in that cartoon.
Yeah, Evil Lag. I love that. It's just this
I like how
crazy
in the movie
monster
he punches a
screaming
camel.
Evil Lag like a Pokemon. Oh,
Imagine
imagine,
when he just casually punched a camel in the movie.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
he and his buddy, like Sub and I, were just like wasted beyond reason. They just stumble through, and he just decks this poor camel in the face.
Just sucker punches.
yeah, like we can't expect any good. I don't actually think any of these stories to do the Shadow correctly requires you to have the guts to take risks, because he is fundamentally this force of nature, this absolute black and white justice vigilante hero. He's not
Like
doing this gray area stuff. It's no, you're a villain. I'm going to kill you now.
Solomon Kane would be even more difficult.
Yeah, no, he's this.
He's like he's the fire and brimstone Puritan.
Yeah, he's a guy who's gonna pull out his rapier, stick it in your throat while citing the Psalms at you and calling you a heathen. Like he's again this moralistic black and white character, and that's part of the fun of him. And the same thing with like Conan is actually a bit more of this gray character, but it is just that seems like a big thing. I'm gonna fight it. This brutal machismo. Like nowadays, I'd be afraid that they'd like do this psychological analysis of Conan, like, oh, he's really hiding a small, vulnerable boy, and you're like, no, that's not what it's about.
I mean, I would.
Like we can't expect these stories to be made or anything like them nowadays, so it's entirely reliant on this open space for normal people to crank out these little stories and reinvigorate this old style of entertainment.
I'm gonna do my version of Conan where he goes to 12th century Italy to beat the church.
Oh, yeah.
A mighty warrior to use the
He picks up the sumo and uses it like a bludgeoning weapon, and just like, there must have been a powerful warrior to wield such a weapon. Yeah, I remember that. No, I think no. Then we came up with that joke after talking about. But we can turn it a little bit back to Franzel in talking about the transfer to comics and the fall of the pulps eventually. But like the initial hold on, Greg, no, the initial meeting of Elric and Conan, because Elric started off as, I think, Moorcock's publisher telling him, just driving by his office one day saying, "Hey, do something like Conan," and he goes, "Sure," but then he just does the exact opposite of Conan, to where, okay, it's not a big, strong barbarian, it's actually a kind of meek sorcerer. He doesn't slay dragons, he rides them. He doesn't fear magic, he uses it like a weapon. But then eventually you have in the comics the meeting of the two. I forget what was published, but it was the Conan the Barbarian comic. I think it was Cometh Elric or something like that, where the transfer from the pulp stories started going into the comics. And for me, that's the point where you start seeing the downfall of the pulps as written medium and being taken up by other things. And Franz, you want to talk a little bit about that? A little bit about the fall of the pulps? Like, where did they go?
Oh, right. Well, essentially, especially with something like the science fiction pulps, you have this kind of terrible situation where it really happened in multiple steps. One of them was the fact that, storytelling kind of changed, and you had especially the publishers and editors of these magazines kind of wanted to do more prestigious stuff and kind of started selecting stories, kind of different writing kind of structures. They kind of this is when kind of like this original science fiction genre really came to be, where you say, okay, science fiction is this and this and this, and it has to be like this, and it has to be cerebral to a certain extent. So you kind of started selecting stories to be that way, and of course, as soon as you did this and replaced the more light-hearted, more straightforward kind of adventure stories with stories that were more niche, of course, you would lose your popular audience. It's also that many of the popular pulp stories kind of made a transition into other mediums, like movie serials were a big one, radio dramas, comic books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a movement from medium, but then also what you're hitting on is this going on to bigger things idea, where the pulps really look like they start off as it's the Wild West of writing. You can kind of do anything. It's like the rock and roll of writing, and I guess Heavy Metal Magazine is the punk, the punk of writing. But then if you lose that edge to it, where it's just this simple, you take your shot, you write your story, it's isolated, it's its own little thing, and it's always this kind of experimental adventure. If it starts taking itself too seriously or going on to that, the bigger things, which eventually happens, that like the Shadow did need to grow into its own shoes and delve into a little bit of its own lore. Same thing with Conan and all the other things, and have their own IPs and their own little corners of the wood. But it still needs to have that same kind of spirit of being able to go back to do those one-off stories. If you lose that, you lose the pulps entirely.
I think.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Also, again, like what I maybe failed to emphasize is, especially with science fiction, because that's kind of the genre that is like most vulnerable to this to happen, is that you had these people coming in who had very much this vision of science fiction as a tool to kind of tell social metaphors, what we've been kind of criticizing. You had people who started kind of transforming it from something simpler like John Carter to something which they perceived as more highbrow, where they could present their utopian visions, and not everyone is interested in that sort of thing. In fact, I would say very few people really are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going to alienate a good portion of your audience. If you, like John Carter is on Mars, for some reason talking about Vietnam, you're losing people. Instead of just go kill the monster, go, have the adventure.
The adventure.
Yeah.
one week you have the adventurer zapping weird creatures with his ray gun. The next week you have the adventurer telling you what the ideal society truly looks like.
Yeah.
Conan just going, my distant father is my real wheel of pain.
You lose the spirit of it as just adventure in the Wild West.
Let me lecture you about this issue.
Oh yeah, not that.
Excuse me, but we're getting attacked by Indians, so why are you lecturing me right now?
Yeah, that's why we have Captain America giving these long discourses and treatises on American society, and no one really wants to touch Solomon Kane. They realize that the discrepancy there. Like Solomon Kane might start talking about the kingdom of heaven and saying it's my job to send it to him. It's his job to sort it out. You can't really do, because the nature of how those characters were written, you can't do it. They're meant for those adventures, that fun, that excitement. It's entertainment fundamentally.
Yes, and the problem is, and again, since science fiction is the most vulnerable for it to happen, this is where it pretty much happened first, is as soon as you kind of get like this new wave of writers in these magazines who kind of want to do the more socially aware kind of writing, who want to try to be a bit more prestigious, a bit more cerebral, and end up alienating people. You also get this kind of looking back on the older works, and you kind of start slandering them.
Uh-huh.
Like we kind of see very similar things with comic books nowadays. Whereas like these stories were really for it was said these stories were really for simpletons. They were made for a low IQ audience. They were misogynistic. They were, racist.
They're launching an attack against the old funny books. Like this was lowbrow literature. Everyone knew it. It was there for fun. It's the Pringles can of literature. And then you're elevating that to, you're putting it on a pedestal, and then waxing philosophical about like, oh, the woe is me of the past. It's just, it's entirely missing the point of it.
You want to distinguish yourself. At least these people wanted to, and of course, the best way to do it is not only to do something new and original. It's to convince people that what you just created was better than what they had before.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, it's to visualize it. They're putting their name at the top of the cover. It's not Solomon Kane's name at the top anymore, like on the cover of the book.
Now, here's one thing I wanted to ask you, Frenzel. Since we're on this subject, like, there is that sort of reputation that the pulps are this sort of like pervy, like brutal, simplistic kind of thing. Now, we all agree that they're just simple stories, but they have a bit more nuance to that. Like, would you?
Yes, sure. I would say that. So it's not completely untrue that you do have. I think there's some stories who had like rape scenes in them, and obviously you do have your fair bit of skull splitting with swords, described in something like Edgar Rice Burroughs stories. You even do have when you really want to touch on racism, you have soulless Asian people and Buck Rogers, and you have H.P. Lovecraft being H.P. Lovecraft.
Yikes.
But it is true that, especially when it comes to like kind of like this image that many people have of like the pulp hero with the heroine of the woman basically being scantily clad.
Yeah, and then like hugging his leg while he holds a sword aloft. Yeah, what is it? The original Star Wars cover, the original Star Wars.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, he's bare chested. This is actually kind of a bit of a revision of these stories. If you look at it, that art kind of originated with Frank Frazetta in the 60s. If you look at something like the covers for John Carter of Mars in the 60s, you very much have this image of scantily clad woman hugging his leg while he's bare chested with a sword, just playing with his muscles.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you then go back to how the story was originally published, you have like princess being dressed in normal princess
No,
clothes.
I've got the cover of the old book actually up on the stream for the image. Like
Yes.
and yeah, and you can see it. It it looks normal.
It looks completely normal. It's not this kind of.
Like the attire looks like it belongs to an actual civilization,
Uh-huh.
not just.
Yeah, it's not like the cover of the old heavy metal magazines where everyone's wearing like the scrap of carpet that they found on their way down the street.
All right, I found some roadkill, guys. We're ready to rock and roll.
Yeah, yeah. It's like they found a single small emaciated rabbit on the side of the road, and then that's what they made their entire wardrobe out of. Yeah. No, but like
Listen,
all the
for 20 of
old
us.
covers of the pulps didn't really have that. It was eventually they got to that when they figured out, oh, sex sells, and these are kind of lowbrow literature books. So yeah, slap it on the cover and we'll sell more books. But that was kind of like
Yeah,
it's that thinking that
It's a
became the
metaphor.
beginning of the end in some respects.
but again, like that was the '60s, and you have to remember which kind of was the main audience at that point. At that point, your audience really was horny teenagers
Uh-huh.
who really had nothing better to do. I think pulps were kind of banished to comic book stores even around that time.
Hmm.
So it was like, yeah, you're going to read them there now. It's kind of limited to a certain kind of rubric of people who might be interested in this, and soon you could kind of slap the "this is just filth" label on it.
Oh, yeah, that's that sort of critique that they're more filthy than mainstream sci-fi, aged poorly.
Yeah, when everything slowly, at least they knew they were lowbrow when they were doing that. The sci-fi that we have now wants to maintain its highbrow while also maintaining its smut, which is worse in my mind.
But let me tell
Yeah.
you why we're more reverent than Conan and Buck Rogers.
Yeah, those stories were self-aware versus you're not. I kind of prefer the self-aware one where it is when they write Conan sleeping with some princess he just met at the beginning of a story, and then the guards come up and he hops out the window and says yeet and knows that, oh, the princess is going to be executed, but I don't care, and jumps out the window. They knew what they were doing. They knew it was smut. They knew it was lowbrow. Nowadays, I don't know if they would try to do social commentary with it. They were just, here's your character. He's just out for adventure in himself. Don't worry about it. Here's the story.
Yes, and it's kind of interesting to see. You just mentioned today, writers kind of want to have their cake and eat it too, and it's funny to see with something like the most recent Star Wars movies, where you have on the one hand you still want your adventure, on the other hand, and now we're going to talk about war prophecy. It's
Yeah, just out
you
of
quickly
nowhere.
have like this clash of tones where, yeah, you know, the one thing literally kind of limits the possibilities of the other thing, and
Where like
getting it in.
Anakin, what did I tell you? The popes are taking over.
Don't slender Revenge of the Sith while I'm around.
No, I love that.
all right, let me get my manifesto.
I actually like Revenge of the Sith because it kind of is that sort of simplistic story of a man who's lost his way and the consequences of that. Like,
It's a
ironically,
very simple and straightforward tragedy, honestly.
Yeah,
I mean,
like
a lot
the story of that actually bears some resemblance of the old Elric story, or at least the grand narrative that kind of goes across the whole thing. For the vast majority of the middle sections of Elric, he's just a mercenary going on adventures, but are tailed end by the major story conflicts of the entire arc of the Elric saga. And he does have that same kind of dreaming in the Dreaming City, where it's he is kind of like Anakin. He's kind of misguided. He's really out for revenge, trying to take his throne. Ends up accidentally killing his wife, and then burning everything to the ground. So he kind of goes Darth Vader for a beat. So Revenge of the Sith, I actually don't mind too much. I know Anakin's downfall is kind of goofy in certain respects, but also kind of realistic. The guy who would become an edgy Darth Vader would be the whiny teenager throwing a tantrum. That would have been his origin.
I think the prequels, though, suffer from the pulps in the sense that they're put on a really high pedestal, mainly, but instead of like an ideological motivation, it's just simply nostalgia.
Yeah.
Which is again is also ironic because the original Star Wars films were just simplistic love letters to.
Yeah. Yeah, the wide-eyed adventurous hero that eventually grows into the hero shoes by the third film and wears the black, becomes a more serious character. But it starts off as this light-hearted adventure of Relbos fighting this evil dark empire. It's very simple, lighthearted, and easy to understand. That's what makes it easy to go back to. We can't go back to these modern Star Wars films. They're not going to be timeless. I sincerely doubt it.
I'm gonna say that the prequels are kind of stand the test of time in a weird sort of way, where even though people are kind of have mixed feelings about their quality itself, like they do seem to look back on them fondly.
Eventually, it's a belated appreciation. Maybe because we've lost our way so much, we develop a nostalgia for it.
It also depends on the generation of people who look at the Star Wars films. For example, like I tend to notice that older millennials and Gen Xers like hate the prequels because mainly because of nostalgia. It's not Luke Skywalker's story. Meanwhile, people in around our generation, early millennials to Generation Z, like we tend to have a more positive view of the prequels because we grew up with it. And now there's the newer Star Wars films. I mean, I think they're trash, but I think they're trash just because they're pontificating, like their politics rather than just.
Yeah, it's a modern movie with Star Wars painted over it, rather than being a Star Wars film with modern technology painted over it, which what the prequels were. Like at the end of the day, the prequels still managed to have Star Wars in it, like that Star Wars heart.
That's actually something kind of interesting, perhaps, to talk about, because we kind of talked about like the very simple and straightforward nature of the pulps, and some people will perhaps call this kind of storytelling a bit too simplistic. And when you look at something like Revenge of the Sith, I feel that is almost like a very good example of something that had its cake and ate it too and did it successfully. Where it does have like some ideas that are perhaps more than the heroes fighting the villain.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yet at the same time, it's still a space opera. It's
yeah,
got
it
all
is.
the goofy stuff.
Yeah, it's still this dramatic, like what is it? Telemundo drama of, you know, you were my brother Anakin, and everyone's teary-eyed, and then there's this shock of the reveal of the evil twin kind of thing. It still has that veneer to it, but it did go beyond the simple good and evil. It's actually a fall story. It's a tragedy. A bit more complex, but it still maintains its very, yeah, it's simple, simplistic, you know, born and bred by the pulps, that original Star Wars heart. Like they still touched on that, and but even in the original Star Wars by Return of the Jedi, these show that with Darth Vader, where it was just, you were my father, you are fallen, but this is now your redemption. So even that's more complicated. Even Luke Skywalker, like when he looks at his robot hand when he's beating the hell out of him, then says, no, I'm not like Vader, I'm like my father who was a Jedi. And he says, I'm not going to kill him, I'm not going to fall. And then it actually, you know, redeems his father, and his father saves the day, blah, 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 blah. That's more complicated than simple good and evil story. But it still remains this very simplistic heart to it that makes it very timeless. It's not bogging itself down with like the problem that a lot of people will have with the prequels. Is they're like bearing down on a bunch of the politics and the background stuff rather than focusing on the relationship of what it should have between Anakin and Obi-Wan, focusing on the relationship between Anakin and his surrogate fathers.
I would say, though, probably the best Star Wars media that came out within the last 5 years was the Clone Wars series and The Mandalorian, because they did what Lucas originally did, just make it a simple story. Like, The Mandalorian is the space gunslinger who's a mercenary, but now he has to learn to live for someone else. Baby Yoda. And then Clone Wars is just what the where the prequel story left off, but it just is a longer version of what just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be done.
Yeah.
And it's like with pulps.
Yeah, we still have some things that we can point to and find that pulp heart of that simplistic story in these little broken up narratives that you can kind of dive right into nowadays. But it's still a matter of, can we get back to it? To me, it's sort of, we can't rely on large, big budget corporation output films. This is something that has to be a labor of love by the people. It has to be a very, and I think we have the opportunity to do it with technology as it is now.
A really cool thing too is by the pulps, by what they were and how we can resurrect them. You don't even have to make the exact copies of the character. You can take some inspiration, but you can make your own story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just think about it. Like, imagine if you just redid Solomon Kane, but make him modern. Like, he's no longer, like, he's not the Victorian guy teleported and time traveled to the future. No, he's Solomon Kane in the 21st century. Like, this religious zealot in a world kind of, hostile to religion, and him going on adventures in that world. It'd be very interesting, and someone can write that with the structures of Solomon Kane as a character, the skeleton for it, and then just put a modern skin on top of it and make it in the modern era, and you could probably do that. The Shadow, again, it's very simple to do that. The Shadow isn't locked in the 40s or something. He's just, I have guns and I kill bad guys. That's all you need for the Shadow.
And the cool thing about the Shadow is there's a
Literally
lot of
always.
subject
Sorry.
matter.
Uh,
I apologize for cutting you off. I'll say.
I was saying, you can literally always do something like Conan or John Carter of Mars. It's
Yeah, it's irrelevant about the time period because they're off on different planets and in different universes entirely.
I mean, Conan is pretty much prehistory, I guess, and
Yeah,
John Carter,
isn't
like-
it weird fantasy Ireland or something? Like that's what it's
yes,
it's
it's
Celtic
weird.
stuff that
What
he
he
was
thought
obsessed with.
Basically, was an Irish American who was like, I wonder what my ancestors were. Oh, a buddy of mine just gave me like the Ulster cycles. Time to make some fan fiction.
Yeah, so it's like it's this hyper fantasized like Celtic culture and history, and then that was
Like
the inspiration of the Silmarillion. Not the Silmarillions. What are they? What is it?
The Hyborians.
No. Cimmerians. That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, the Sumerians were
Yeah.
the ancestors of the Irish and Scottish,
Uh-huh.
and their ancestors were the Atlanteans. The Vikings are just the same, and then the Native Americans, the time of Conan, are called the Picts. Which I just think is hilarious.
It's kind of ironic.
Oh
And
yeah.
yeah, like with John Carter, just go in the future. You go on a different planet. Like you can do whatever you want. To like you can make up whatever kind of culture you want to see. You can.
The cool thing about John Carter is it's got the best of both sci-fi and fantasy, where you could have this sort of primordial world, Mars, that you can explore, but it's also technically sci-fi, so you can give your heroes like laser guns, flying gizmos, and still have a sword fight with aliens. At the end of the day, it sort of combines sci-fi with that sort of Victorian era optimism you get from those classic literatures like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if I want to turn this and make this really geeky about something that I'm
we've already
kind of...
passed the point.
Yeah, I know. We talked about Star Wars and the pulps, and like, I'm just going all in.
Now
It's
talking
actually...
about Buckaroo Banzai.
You can talk about it if you want. I'll hear it out.
No,
But-
yeah, go first.
Yeah, no, what I'm thinking of is something that I have a passing fancy with, but it is the kind of... We do have something similar to the pulps in Japan in the form of light novels with the long-running series Vampire Hunter D, which is like... It looks like it takes inspiration from Solomon Kane. It's a guy with a wide-brimmed hat and a big sword who goes and hunts magical creatures and goes on these adventures, and each one is primarily isolated. So it is this kind of universalizable standard of writing, a kind of form. It's very free-flowing. I mean, like, these are light novels, but each one of them is a kind of isolated story that you can kind of pick up and drop off. They have some kind of overarching narrative of D is looking for a guy. That's it. The rest of it is entirely a mystery. We're kind of left in the dark, and we just enjoy the fun of the hunt. Of him, like, it's this weird mixture of noir, fantasy, science fiction. He rides a robot horse, but there's magic and vampires. It's set 20 billion years in the future, something crazy. Every one of these stories is always a mystery. It's always, here's the body of someone. It's not a normal vampire. We need to know what's going on, and D has to figure out what's going on and kill the damn thing. So it's this really interesting marrying of a lot of disparate genres and styles, but still, again, in this very pulp form that makes it very easily consumable and easy to get into. Which is why I always have a passing fancy with it, and I pick it up every once in a while.
I saw the movie for Vampire Hunting Team, and I would say I'm pretty impressed with it.
Yeah, there's two of them. There's the one from the 80s, which was I guess requires nostalgia for. But then there's the second one. Really, that one's good. I think that's from the second or third. No, I think it's the third book that they take that story from.
Okay, I'll be right back. This will take me 5 minutes.
Mhm.
Not saying I'm gonna leave a giant boulder on your shoulders, Ronzel, but I might leave a giant boulder on your shoulders.
No, I'm turning him into my Sisyphus. He wanted to talk about Buckaroo Banzai. He can talk about Buckaroo Banzai.
All right. So,
All right.
have you ever watched the movie The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension?
Absolutely not. I don't watch movies. Not too much.
All right. So, The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension is a movie that came out in the 1980s, and it stars Peter Weller and is about Buckaroo Banzai, who is this rock star slash neurosurgeon slash test pilot slash nuclear scientist slash samurai who goes on various adventures with with his group of genius friends who are like all the best in their field, and it's mainly kind of concerned with this device, the overthruster, with which you can travel through solid matter and through dimensions, and this kind of unravels a whole plot about an alien invasion, which is kind of linked to Orson Welles' 1938 War of the Worlds radio drama, and ultimately leads into classic good versus evil kind of story. So the reason why I kind of mentioned this movie is because, as you can probably guess already from the premise, is that it's very much influenced by the pulps. It's a very straightforward homage to something like Doc Savage. In fact, much of the premise is lifted from Doc Savage. That being said, like what perhaps differentiates the Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension from something like Star Wars, or even I don't know, the 1980s Conan or Flash Gordon, is that Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension is very much aware of one joke it kind of plays off in like almost what seems like an anti-comedy routine, where it treats itself like it's part of this giant franchise with all these different lore references, but there isn't a real Buckaroo Banzai lore. It's like a standalone movie that acts as though it's part of this giant long-spanning series with, so it will give you these references to random events that don't really have any context outside of the film. So it kind of takes a bit of an ironic, humorous approach to this kind of material.
Yeah, well, yeah, because none of this stuff really takes itself that seriously.
It's kind of, honestly, it's kind of interesting to see something like this, because do you think that modern fiction, even though we already kind of discussed that it's sometimes takes itself too seriously and is trying to be too cerebral to the point of being kind of pretentious and taking the fun out of it, do you think that, on the other hand, sort of like action movie, adventure story kind of fiction can be a bit too self-referential and a bit too wink-wink. Look.
I kind of like it. I do like the 80s action film. I mean, like, I can't defend otherwise. I'm a big fan of the Metal Gear Solid series. And that is just, like, 80s action movie writing nonsense. But, like,
Sure.
it's thoroughly
The
enjoyable
80s
as
nonsense.
entertainment.
The 80s nonsense is great, but then you kind of get something like the kind of the Marvel movies, which have the need to point out how stupid they are every 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, there's a version of it that's sincere, and there's a version of it that's not. Where
So
it's a
would you
kind
say
where
that
it
it's
is lowbrow, it doesn't take itself seriously the whole way through, and then there's the kind of, oh, I'm being tongue-in-cheek, a little bit cheeky, but no, this is still serious. This was just comic relief for a second. There's a little bit of a difference. Like, Metal Gear, I don't think can ever be said to actually, no, plenty of people can say it takes itself too seriously at points when it starts talking about nuclear deterrence and all that stuff. But when, like, in, what is it, the Twin Snakes, when Snake is doing backflips off of RPG rockets as they're flying through the air, you can't look at that and say, oh, it's up its own ass. I don't think you can say that. You can't look at Arnold Schwarzenegger's Commando, and when it's being really tongue-in-cheek and cutesy, you can't blame it, because it knows what it's doing. It knows what it is. But in the Marvel movies, these are massive, high-budget films that want to be taken seriously to a certain extent. They want to be these cultural icons, and they got it. You got millions of people lining up in front of the theater like it's a new cult. It's the new thing in fashion. And when they do it, it feels weird. It's a different kind. It's not sincere kind of awareness of what it is.
So you would say like this, that something that's kind of just lovingly winking at you is a bit different than the more cynical approach of something like the
Yeah,
Marvel.
when something like The Evil Dead does its goofy stuff, it feels like a bunch of guys who makes movies being at my level, giving me a wink and a nudge, versus the other one where it's very kind of pretentious and it feels like a top-down differential. Like, when you watch The Evil Dead and they do that wink, wink, nudge, nudge stuff, it feels like a buddy of yours is making an inside joke to you in, like, a letter they wrote you. The other one, it feels very convoluted, feels very dishonest to a certain degree, and it doesn't have the same... you kind of spit in its face when it does it to you.
Yeah. So you would say that like a certain level of irony might actually be welcome if it's not like in your haha, this is so stupid, but more like
Like when there's an
we're,
awkward.
we're here to have a bit of fun, just lean back and enjoy yourself.
Like when they have the awkward pauses sometimes in the Marvel movie to make it seem funnier. It just comes off as like one of those awkward puns where you hear the drum. You know if you ever see in like a cartoon or a comedy skit, you see someone make a bad joke, you hear it kind of feels like on that level.
Yeah, it's very calculated. They're like, okay, we're gonna do this. We're gonna make the funny haha reference. Oh, I recognize it. I clapped. I laughed at it. I knew what it was. And we'll leave the little space for them all to clap in the theater. It's like, it's calculated. It's so cynical. Versus...
That's why I like something like Buckaroo Banzai more, because there's like this wonderful moment in the movie where they're in the science laboratory and they're trying to get some bad guys who entered into the laboratory. And they walk by a watermelon where experiments are done on it, and the new guy in the group asks what a watermelon is for, and they say, okay, we explain it later. It's never explained ever again in the movie. It's a reference to another story that doesn't really exist. But at the same time, it doesn't really, it's not too on the nose. It's a bit of a blink it and you miss it moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very quiet, and it feels like it was more for the people making the film than this calculated,
Yes.
like they did audience
kind of
testing
the
for
charm of the
it.
film.
Yeah, it's a kind of, and then the audience who are inside on the joke, they laugh, and it feels like you and the creators in the film are on the same level, versus this passive experience of the billion-dollar movie where everything was calculated and feels very cynical. So that's where I generally draw the line with that kind of tongue-in-cheekness. There's a way to do it honestly, and there's a way to do it very cynically and dishonest.
Yes, there's probably also like the big difference that like the Marvel movies, they're mass entertainment movies were like they're for the lack of a better term, they are blockbusters kind of made for everyone to enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of build these references in so that everyone can feel kind of like a bit of a smug sense of superiority at like the movie, almost. Like,
Yeah.
aha, I get this reference too.
Because I consumed the other movie.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, with something like the funny thing is about something like Buckaroo Banzai. It is a cult film because if you're not kind of like in the right mindset for the movie, you will probably not enjoy it.
Yeah.
It-
It's a cult film. It's kind of like a Rocky Horror Picture Show or something like that, where you're either there to like it or you're never watching it. It's for a specific audience.
Sure. So
All right. Well, I'm kind of feeling like we've spent it. We've started going into movie stuff and away from the pulp. So unless we've got anything else.
This was an impressive rabbit hole, fellas. I can't really think of anything else other than just what are things about the pulps you guys like. But other
Yeah.
than that, I think we had a good run.
No, I think the only thing we didn't quite talk about was, I know we've had conversations before about fiction and how that is a kind of prime space for like re-representing old ideas and values, especially in the pulps, because that is the Wild West of writing. So it provides the space to write these kind of more classical stories.
It also has very, I would say, like aside from like the stuff in the '60s you see, and even then in some parts to a degree that artwork too. Pulp fiction art covers are some of the best I've seen for a book or just art in general.
yes.
In fact, they're able to capture the epic and grandness of that universe with a simple picture.
I wish science fiction book covers still looked like that.
Oh, they were fantastic.
Especially like the especially like the '70s art you see, like whoa. Like the amount of detail into the shadowing alone.
Yeah, these were full-on paintings.
Yes, I admittedly always get kind of frustrated when I pick a science fiction book from the bookstore, and the cover feels very generic, and then you see what they originally did with it, or what a comparable story from this pulp era did with this sort of cover.
Or you see like a really
like-
obnoxious modern art presentation on the book.
Yeah, like I'm thinking of the two images in my mind of what modern sci-fi makes their stuff look like versus what that like punk period of science fiction used to be on the cover of their stuff. Like modern science fiction, all like you can imagine all the spaceships. It's almost brutalist. They're very bricky, like almost in a way too
It's
real.
the same basic spaceship design over.
Over and over again. Versus I'm thinking about some covers I've seen from like that golden age back in the past, and they just looked weird, dude. They looked like acid trips. These like neon hyper like burn your retina colors in these crazy shapes, and it looks alien to you. You look at that and you go, "That's nuts. I want to know more about it." It looks like a different world, versus
Like the
just box ships in space. That's
The
uninteresting.
Barstool series especially does that, where like you could see like someone like John Carter or a Martian, and they're just dueling in this random giant canyon, and like you could see the sun lighting in the background, as if you were there, and just this giant, hundreds of miles long, with these ancient cities dotting it with a canal, and you're just like, wow.
Yeah, it has imagination. It has the ability to dream, or it feels like where we are now is in the state of constant, perpetual nostalgia for a very cynical version of what we had. So that's why we can only reproduce the same thing again and again and again. Versus, like, you look at old sci-fi, and they thought that no, there is a fantastic future that is imaginable. There's so much we can imagine and create. There's a lot of a kind of like a childish hopefulness in the worlds that they were constructing half the time, and nowadays it's very bleak, brutalist.
That's something I would like perhaps to kind of talk about, since would it perhaps be necessary to also kind of rediscover some of that ethos to kind of write these sorts of stories? Like if you look at something like John Carter of Mars, sure, we can say they're actually like closer to fantasy stories than they are to what we would nowadays call science fiction stories. But if you remember, around the time these stories came out, you had people speculating about channels on Mars, and might there be fallen civilizations on Mars as well? And if someone could be there, like the gravity wouldn't be as strong. So could they just take huge leaps? And you kind of see how, even though it's not very highly scientific, you can see how these authors get like these basic tidbits of like information. And they already start dreaming up like these sort of scenarios. And as you said, there really is like this hopefulness and like this kind of wonder behind it. Well, nowadays it seems more like we're stuck in the same sort of science fiction mold for forever and ever, where we're like, okay, we know what the genre is, we know this has to be added, this has to be added, and this has to be added.
Laser guns, let's go.
Spaceship laser guns. There's probably a galactic empire.
Or like a giant one world government. That's always a democracy.
Yes,
Yeah,
giant world government.
The science fiction of Dune seems like a long cry off, where in an average sci-fi piece of media nowadays, you're not going to have an event in it called Muad'Dib's Jihad from like the second book, I think, where it's just this really weird marrying of Islam to science fiction in a desert planet with giant worms. Stuff's nuts. You get box ships with like weird Star Wars, Star Trek stuff, and you just get the same thing again. So it's kind of it's very disappointing. Where, and it's just my whole theory about it, where a lot of media is very bloated, a lot of big budget stuff, so they can't take risks and do stuff that's weird and interesting anymore. They have to do what they know will sell. So then you just get the same thing over and over again. That's why the real revolutionary area that you can go to if you really want to create good stuff, interesting stuff of actual quality, you got to go back to the Wild West. You got to go back to the pulps. This cheaply produced, easily printable short stories that allows for experimentation. But the experimentation here is actually a rediscovery of these much more classic styles of writing, instead of this very cynical, almost like deconstructionist style of story writing where everything needs to be a gray area and you don't know who is the hero and villain. No, just go back to Solomon Kane saying, men will die for this. I will bring about simple justice. Simple, and like that's experimental now, because we've done the whole we don't know the real moral standing of anybody. We've done that already. It's tired and done with.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? Like with all like the supposed moral complexity in modern stories, like as soon as you see like a straightforward hero just killing straightforward villains,
that becomes punk rock, where just a simple
Whoa there, that's a bit like a
just some fire and brimstone guy citing the Psalms at you and stabbing a guy for being a heathen, and that's your hero. Like, instead of this like, oh, this moral gray area we just don't know. No, the real punk rock is actually moralism for writing now, because everyone has done, like, young adult fiction is terrible for this, of where it's always the special main character versus the oppressive, you're not my dad society. Like, I think, what is it, Hunger Games does this, Harry Potter kind of does this to some certain degree or another.
That recent one that got a movie, what's it called? Mortal Engines.
Yeah, Mortal Engines does it. They all do the same story fundamentally, versus, no, just give me the guy who's straightforward about his stuff and just tell me his story. Just tell me his adventure. Like, that becomes the new novelty now, is going backwards, weirdly enough.
Wait, you're saying he does not have like a 3 books worth of backstory? He's just
Yeah,
out there on
he
an
doesn't have a sob
adventure.
story. He's just a guy. Just like it's almost like the spaghetti westerns of Clint Eastwood, where they don't really share anything in common, even though it's still kind of the same character in a lot of those Clint Eastwood spaghetti western films. But
Just a guy
it's
who's
just
got
another day. It's just another day in the West. He just shows up to a town. Something's wrong. There's a party. There's an adventure, and he goes off into the sunset, and you don't know what happens next.
Yeah, because
What his new adventure is.
like pulps really have this good method of just presenting you with a mystery of these kind of characters, and you always keep guessing.
Yeah, it's always a day in the life. You don't know where they were before or where they're going. It's always just this very isolated Wild West kind of story. It is Blondie rolling up to a random town and getting into some trouble.
Like, I don't need to know what store he got his boots from. I just want to know who he is now and what he does now.
I just need to know his name is the Shadow and why he's shadowing. He's got guns. Evil lurks in the hearts of men. Bang bang,
No,
go.
we're not like this great English teacher. Sorry,
You just
I need to know.
You see Conan the Barbarian throw a sorcerer against the wall and goes, "But before I cave your skull in, I need to tell you about where I went to go learn to read."
I didn't.
Actually, I can see Conan doing that.
That's actually a good one. We should. And just splats the guy's head.
Yeah. All right. I think we've spent ourselves.
We did.
Yeah, we've been going on for about almost 90 minutes, and not too many people watching. We don't really have any questions in the chat. We'll let it play itself out for a tad, but I think we're good.
Do I have any questions? Like,
We can wait for some amount of time for some questions to roll in. I'll go get myself a drink, and I'll come back, and we'll see if anything rolls in. You can talk amongst yourself. I'll be right back.
all right, so
There's a guy on the Discord. We're getting the questions from the Canis Discord, correct?
yeah, sure, we can.
There's one in the live stream chat by Mr. X, if you want to check that one out.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. One of the microphones is bad, I apologize about that. But here's his question. Culture. The West has very little culture. Most of what exists is anti-culture. Western culture doesn't really cultivate much of anything. Yeah, that's the only question we have so far.
It doesn't really seem to be a. It doesn't seem really seem to be a question. It's a bit of a tangent. No offense to Mr. X.
I mean, I can understand how modern media can be trash, but I think that's kind of the point of us having this whole stream anyway. To show you from a time when there was a confident Western culture, and what you could do with the present.
Funny thing is, this isn't even too far away in the past. Like, we're
Oh,
not
it's
talking about back in the medieval era when heroes still used to be. We're talking about honestly up to like what the 80s. Like, you could even extend it to the 2000s if you want to.
Your grandparents probably read some of this stuff, so very realistic possibility. There is a continuum. You just gotta know where to look. Like, I mean,
I know for a fact that my great grandfather loved reading Karl May Western books.
this is
Karl May was a German Western author. He essentially wrote pulps.
So the Germans have their own version of pulp. That's pretty interesting. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, yeah, sure. So, we have like the basic kind of stuff that Americans have too. Like, I remember my mother telling me about having read some, romance kind of stories and pulps or Groschenromane, how we call them. Groschenroman basically means penny novel, so it's a very cheap kind of thing you buy. It's the best.
I gotcha.
And beyond that, actually one of the most long-running and successful science fiction stories is a German pulp story called Barry Roden.
What's that one about?
It's a typical kind of going through the universe, going on adventures, kind of ray gun science fiction.
So kind of like Buck Rogers if he was a crowd.
Yes, I don't even. He isn't even a crowd. It's just written by a crowd.
I see. But yeah, it's like to answer Mr. X's question, like there is still culture in the West. You just gotta know where to look. I think this whole defeatist attitude is a major problem, where it stifles us from solving this kind of issue where we have a bloated entertainment industry that lacks creativity. I just think the sort of defeatist attitude kind of gets in the way of that, which is kind of the whole purpose of this live stream, to show people a foundation where they can build it from. No offense to you, Mr. X. I'm pretty sure you're coming from a well-meaning place, but that's just my take on the whole matter.
Okay, I've sat back down. So we do have some questions in the chat here, so let me take a look here.
Yeah, there's one from Mr. X that we were kind of answering that.
Oh, I completely ignored it because it's dumb. Yeah, I'm the hard ass of the group. That's very apparent. But we do have one about any good pulp recommendations you'd recommend. I've been reading Elric the Vanishing Tower during the stream. Anything like that? The Vanishing Tower is very isolated for the most part. The better one to pick up actually is Fortress of the Pearl, if you want to get into Elric as the sellsword, where that one is just this kind of isolated adventure. He starts off in one location, gets into some trouble, has to go on this big, quest to do stuff. And its ending, in fact, is very emblematic of Elric as a character, as an anti-hero. He's not, he's the anti-Conan. He's not supposed to be the guy you're rooting for because he's a good guy. He's he goes into downright evil on occasions, and Fortress of the Pearl gives you everything that is Elric. It's very good to just get into him as a character and how it functions. Otherwise, there's like 7 omnibus books of all the stories collected together. The major story points are going to be in the first one, Elric of Melniboné, the Dreaming City, that story, and then towards the end, Stormbringer. That's where you're going to find the very big, overarching story parts of Elric, and the rest of them is all just his little adventures in between. Like Sailors on the Seas of Fate, he goes through like several adventures while he's hitting some plot points that are necessary. So really it would be Elric of Melniboné, Sailors on the Seas of Fate, then maybe Stormbringer.
Like for John Carter, I think it's pretty easy to say you should just pick up a Princess of Mars. That's the first story that introduces who he is and just what he does. And just the first one's always the best one to try for any story.
Other than that, like you can get reprints of the Amazing Stories very easily. Like you can, I think you can just go on Amazon and look for like collector's editions of the Amazing Stories books.
Actually, Razor Fist, that one of the YouTuber Razor Fist actually had a link in his video for all of Robert E. Howard's Solomon Kane stories. The family, actually, their organization for allowing the publishing of his works, made a whole giant tome of the stories, recreated faithfully as they are. So you can just get the whole thing in one book, which is awesome.
Other than that, many of these things are public domain. You will find PDF copies of them. Like, I know that Internet Archives have like all of the Buck Rogers stories published in the 20s and 30s. Many books are now getting republished. Actually, stuff by Lee Brackett gets republished a lot. Lee Brackett was a female pulp author who kind of specialized in science fiction. She also wrote Western movies. She wrote a lot of the John Wayne movies, and she drafted the first screenplay for The Empire Strikes Back.
Oh, that's cool. But yeah, the book itself is called The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane. I think he also has another version of Conan.
And then for the Shadow, I know one of the big emblematic comics of the Shadow is actually Hitler's Astrologer. That is very good Shadow of, post World War II, big mystery. It's one of the jewels of the Shadow mythos. And then I'm trying to remember some of the pulps. It's been a very long time since I've ever looked at the Shadow pulp, so I don't remember any of those off the top of my head. All right. Then we have the general question of how has pulp fiction shaped society? A lot, a little, or not at all. And then he goes on to do this long quote, Doc Savage, like ethos or credo, something like that.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah. How has pulp fiction shaped society? A lot, a little, or none at all? Doc Savage had a strong moral oath, and then it's a long quote from Doc Savage.
I would say that in a sense it has shaped society a lot when we just kind of look at the stories we tend to consume nowadays, or the stories we're actually quite fond of exploring. We talked about Star Wars, we talked about comic books, you talked about Vampire Hunter D. Like, these things are essentially inspired by this sort of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Of course,
right.
like, we kind of get like the general feeling of how these stories are supposed to work. So in that sense, I think there's like a huge influence of the pulps. That being said, like when it comes to like the kind of way of writing itself, like you can see how the influence has kind of lessened over the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's more shaping how we tell stories and the forms that they take. In terms of society, for me at least, it's going to be they're more reflective and reflexive of what's going on at the time. Like, again, going back to that Shadow example, that was a Shadow story reflexively talking about something that happened in the real world, responding to World War II vets coming back home. So it's less that they are positively changing, because it feels way too bold to say that anything from the pulps, like say, shaped the anti-war movement in the 1960s or something like that. If anything, it reflected that sentiment, in which case they'd be cultural artifacts that you can use to look at the kind of mindset at the time. So that's why when you look at these older Shadow stories, it's very simple justice of a kind of where we had more trust in institutions like the police. So the idea of a guy who just goes out, delivers justice, plain and simple, was kind of easy to consume. It wasn't immediately offensive as it might be now with how we look at institutions with a lot more skepticism. So then you get the transformation into something like Dirty Harry, where that's like in the I forget when the movies came out. I know in the 1970s at least, but maybe late 60s. I'm not quite sure.
1970s.
Yeah, 1970s. Yeah, because it's right around that time where you start getting this skepticism of institutions like the police and the justice system. So then the story then becomes the man who is trying to actually deliver justice, contrary to all this bureaucratic nonsense that, like in the first movie of Dirty Harry, they go, yeah, we have to let him go because you didn't file the evidence wrong. So it's inadmissible evidence. This rifle that is plainly used to have killed multiple people, he gets off the hook. So what does Harry do? Get on the back of a bus, chase him down on the freeway, and shoot him down with a 44. So that becomes emblematic of that period of this skepticism of police officers and the justice system to do what they're there to do, which is deliver justice and protect victims and rectify wrongdoings. So the Shadow shows much more of a confidence in those institutions versus later on in the 70s where you start seeing skepticism, where nowadays it's actually almost antithetical. It's almost anarchist in a few areas, I would say.
You can also kind of see that in something like the Death Wish movies, I would say. Where
yeah, again, 1970s.
Yeah. We have to take justice in our own hands.
Oh, yeah. And then you get that great... Hold on, I got someone at the door. Be right back.
Gotcha. But yeah, vigilante really kicked off after the 70s, especially when you start seeing more riots in American history. Like the Harlem riots in the 60s onwards, LA riots in the 90s, that kind of thing.
Okay. Did we pick up somewhere, or do we still want to talk about Death Wish for a second?
Yeah.
We can pick up more questions. We don't. Do you want to talk more about Death Wish, Greg?
Oh.
I mean, you could. I mean, I don't know much about Death Wish. You could just.
No.
educate me on
The
that.
basic. All I was gonna say is that it's the similar kind of 1970s, not ethos, but it has that same kind of mentality of this. The justice system is not doing what it's supposed to do, and this was during a crime wave. Remember, in the 1970s in America. So then you get this response, this reflexivity in the art of kind of showing our desires and actually help form them to some degree or another. This desire for this simple justice and rectification of wrongdoings, where a man who was, I think, an architect to begin with, his family is killed, and then he picks up a gun and starts killing just bad guys. That's it. He takes justice into his own hand as vigilante. And it actually shows a very... He's not doing it like the Punisher, where he suddenly becomes this razor-toothed killing machine. At least not by the first movie. By Death Wish 3, absolutely. But he kills his first guy, and he starts throwing up, and he's having this revulsion to what he's done. But it's still this deep desire reflected in that film of a desire for the simplistic kind of justice and rectification of violence. Against a system that is pretty negligent of it and lets people go and doesn't actually deliver justice. So that's the examples, and the main point here is saying that most of the time what art does, especially popular media, is mostly reflective or reacting to something in some way. I'm a lot more skeptical of any claims of art forming society in a very simplistic manner. I get a little bit more complicated about that, but that's an entirely different topic.
Alright, do we have any further questions in the
Yeah,
chat?
let me check. No, we haven't had anything else come in.
Alright.
Yeah, so I think we're done. I think we're good. We went for over 100 minutes, and I think we did good. All right.
Fellas, it was nice letting me hop on for the ride. It was
Mhm.
a good stream.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you as well. I quite enjoyed this.
This was worth the 50 Reddit gold I did.
All right.
Sorry for some verbal slip-ups.